Zariah Monroe walked into class expecting to learn not to be humiliated. Her teacher, Miss Simmons, smiled sweetly, right before pouring superglue into her hair. But what no one knew was that Zariah's grandfather was Shaquille Big Shaq O'Neal, the silent owner of the school. Now the truth is spreading, the system is cracking, and justice is no longer waiting quietly. This isn't just one girl's story, it's a reckoning. What happens when the powerful stay silent until they don't? Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. In a sunlit classroom, no one saw the darkness dripping from a teacher's heart. Jefferson Academy for Excellence stood like a promise. White-pillared, glass-windowed, manicured to near perfection. Parents called it a beacon of progressive learning, and the brochures showcased smiling children of all shades and sizes under fluttering American flags. But behind the golden seal etched on the oak-paneled doors and the staff photos framed in chrome, the real lessons weren't in the curriculum. They were hidden, coded, passed quietly in narrowed eyes and sterilized smiles. It was the first week of spring term, and the morning sun fell in ribbons across room 3B, where Ms. Lorelei Simmons stood at the front of the class like she'd won the lottery. She wore her usual lemon-colored blazer and pastel scarf, and her hair curled just slightly at the ends in a perfectly practiced way that gave her an aura of safe suburban warmth. She had one of those smiles that the PTA moms called trustworthy. Wide, rehearsed, and barely touching her eyes. Across from her, near the third window from the back, sat Zariah Monroe, 13, brilliant and unbothered. Zariah didn't have to try to shine. She carried herself with a confidence that wasn't loud, but magnetic. Her notebooks were always neat, her questions sharper than the textbooks, and her eyes deep brown and serious, rarely looked for approval. She was proud of her cornrows, her voice, her skin. Not proud in a way that needed to prove anything, just certain. And certainty, in the wrong environment, becomes threat. Zariah's grandfather was a mystery to most of the school. She lived with her mother and grandmother in a modest house near Pine Bridge, and while other kids bragged about Teslas and ski trips, Zariah never flexed. What no one knew, not her classmates, not her teachers, not even the principal, was that the very land Jefferson Academy was built on had been bought years ago by a quiet investor. That investor went by many names in his public life: basketball legend, commentator, entrepreneur. But to Zariah, he was just Grandpa Shaq. Big Shaq. Shaquille O'Neal had put millions into the school under a different name, choosing to stay in the shadows. He didn't want fame attached to education. He wanted access. A better shot for kids like Zariah, in places where doors were already cracked open for others. But what he didn't know, what no one did, was that inside those pristine classrooms, something rotten had taken root. Miss Simmons had taught at Jefferson for 6 years and built a reputation as one of the safe white teachers. She sprinkled in black authors during reading month. She wore Black Lives Matter pins during meetings. She said diversity like it was a yoga pose. But in private, in the small gaps between praise and punishment, her true nature slipped through. It started small. She complimented Zariah's vocabulary, then asked, "Do you speak like that at home too?" She told her she was articulate, then warned her about sounding too aggressive. She smiled when Zariah corrected her pronunciation of Chimamanda Adichie's name, then subtly marked her down for attitude. She offered her advice with a tone dipped in sugar and steel. Zariah noticed. She always noticed. The other kids didn't say much. A few laughed nervously when Miss Simmons made her pointed jokes. Others shifted in their seats. But Zariah stood firm. She didn't speak up, not yet, but she didn't shrink either. And that bothered Miss Simmons. "She thinks she's special," the teacher muttered one day in the break room, pouring coffee while another teacher scrolled on her phone and said nothing. "I've taught plenty of girls like her, just need a little humbling." No one corrected her. No one reported her. Because sometimes racism didn't wear a hood or carry a slur. Sometimes it wore pastels and perfume and held a clipboard with a student's name circled in red. By the second week, Miss Simmons had started using Zariah as a teaching moment. In front of the class, she'd overcorrect her, ask her to read passages twice, question her interpretations, only to praise other students who said less but looked more familiar. Zariah held her composure. She didn't cry, she didn't break, but at home she grew quiet. Her mother Simone noticed the difference, but didn't press too hard. "Long day, baby?" she'd ask gently. Zariah would nod. "Yeah, just school stuff." Lucille, her grandmother, watched more closely, and in her own way, so did Shaq. He would call in the evenings, his voice low and warm. "How's my champion?"
"Good, Grandpa."
"You sure?" "Mm-hmm." Shaq wasn't fooled. He remembered too well what it felt like being young, Black, gifted, and still made to feel like an intrusion. He'd sat in locker rooms and been told he was lucky to be there. He'd watched coaches freeze him out. He'd been praised for his strength, but not his mind. So when Zariah hesitated, even for a second, he took note. But he didn't intervene. Not yet. He believed in her strength, and in letting her write her own story. He just didn't know how far that story was about to be pushed.
One Thursday, Miss Simmons announced an art integration project. Each student was to bring a piece of their cultural background to class and present it in creative form. Zariah worked all weekend with her grandmother on a beautiful paper collage, showing the women in her family, generations of strength, culture, and resilience. She glued stories, photos, words.
Monday came. The sun poured into the classroom. Zariah walked in proud, holding her collage, but she never got to share it. Miss Simmons forgot to include her on the schedule. Maybe next time, she said with a tight smile. Zariah sat down slowly, her project still in her arms. Her hands trembled. She didn't know if it was rage or shame. And that's when it happened. Later that day, during cleanup, Miss Simmons approached her. "Zariah, come here. I need your help with the supplies." On the side table sat an open bottle of superglue. Miss Simmons had been using it with another student for a poster. "Hold this," she said, handing Zariah a sheet. "Careful not to mess up your hair." Zariah didn't flinch. "It's fine," she replied coolly. Miss Simmons smiled too sweetly, turned with a small squeeze of the bottle, and somehow casually accidentally tilted it too far. A thin stream of glue dripped from the nozzle, slow, deliberate, right into the back of Zariah's hair. Silence. One student snickered, another gasped. Zariah froze. The glue stung, not her scalp but her pride. She turned slowly, eyes locked with Miss Simmons, who feigned a gasp. "Oh my goodness, I didn't mean to. These bottles are so tricky." The smile returned, not kind, but performative. Zariah didn't scream. She didn't cry. She placed the paper sheet down on the table, straightened her spine, and walked out of the room. Not a word. Behind her, the classroom remained frozen. Miss Simmons muttered apologies to no one in particular. No one reported it. No one comforted her. But one student, Jules, pale-skinned, freckled, quiet, sat unmoving, watching. And far away, in a quiet office where a tall man reviewed building blueprints and budget plans, Shaquille O'Neal stared at his phone, reading a short text from Lucille. "You need to come. Something's wrong." What begins with compliments slowly turns into humiliation no one dares to name. Monday morning came too quickly. Zariah sat in her seat at the far side of room 3B, hair still stiff from what was left of the glue. Her mother had worked through the weekend to detangle it. Warm olive oil, whispered prayers, and her grandmother's soft voice humming songs older than pain. The glue hadn't reached her scalp, but it had clung to strands with intent, and no amount of conditioner or combing could make her forget the way it felt. Cold, slow, intentional.
Mrs. Simmons never apologized, not in the way that counted. Her emails to Zariah's mother were laced with professionalism and concern. A classroom mishap, no permanent harm. These things happen. Zariah knew better, but she had no proof. No witness brave enough to stand up.
Instead, the week began with something worse than silence. Praise. "Oh, Zariah, you're just glowing today," Miss Simmons chirped as she passed by her desk. "That's the spirit, always showing up with dignity, no matter what's going on in that head of yours." Zariah didn't answer. "I mean, look at her," the teacher said louder, as if speaking to the entire class. "This is what resilience looks like, folks. You all could learn something from her." The class laughed softly, not cruelly but nervously. Some smirked. Others exchanged glances. Zariah caught Jules staring down at his desk, ashamed, maybe. But he said nothing. Again. In the teacher's lounge, Simmons shared her wisdom with a younger substitute. "That girl's smart, but she's got edge. If you don't shape it early, they start thinking they know more than you." A few chuckled. One sipped coffee and muttered, "You always say the wildest things," but no one corrected her. Zariah felt the shift. Where her classmates once joked with her, now they hesitated. Lunch tables that once welcomed her, now filled up faster than usual. Group projects came with silence when she walked in the room. She wasn't being bullied. It was more invisible than that. She had become inconvenient. After class, she walked past the rows of lockers, headphones in, though no music played. It helped her tune out the whispers. A few feet behind her, Miss Simmons spoke with Principal Harding, her voice sugary and professional. "She's adjusting well," Simmons said. "Really showing maturity, don't you think?" Harding nodded absently. "As long as her grades don't slip." They didn't ask Zariah how she felt. They never did. At home, her grandmother Lucille noticed. She always did. Lucille had raised 3 children in the thick of the 60s, and there wasn't a shift in posture or a silence too subtle that she couldn't read like scripture. "You're quieter lately," she said one night as they folded laundry together. "I'm tired," Zariah mumbled. Lucille nodded. "What kind of tired?" Zariah hesitated. "The kind that doesn't go away with sleep." Lucille didn't push. She reached over, gently brushing her fingers across Zariah's temple. "When you're ready to speak, I'll be here, and so will your story." Simone, Zariah's mother, was less perceptive, though not for lack of love. She worked late hours at a nonprofit downtown and came home with shoulders full of the world's burdens. When she asked how school was, it was through the lens of a parent who didn't want more fires to put out. "It's fine," Zariah always said. "I'm managing." And she was, on paper. Her grades remained high, her essays were detailed, her math clean, but her spark, her joy in learning, her casual laughter dimmed week by week. The real lessons Miss Simmons taught weren't found in any textbook. They came in praise so sharp it stung, in a tone so pleasant it confused, in compliments that corroded confidence. When Zariah answered a question with clarity, Simmons clapped her hands. "Wow, I'm impressed. Where did you learn that?" When Zariah used a complex term in an essay, the comment read, "Very ambitious vocabulary. Did someone help you with this?" When she sat with a book during break, Simmons leaned in with a smile. "You know, if you smiled more, you'd look less intimidating. People might approach you." Each word was dipped in poison and sugar. Zariah kept a journal in her room, tucked beneath the bottom drawer of her nightstand. She didn't write in full sentences, only fragments. "The way she looks at me when I answer. Why does she act like I'm a surprise? Praise should feel good. It doesn't." She didn't show anyone the journal, but one afternoon, after a long board meeting, Shaq stopped by the house. He never asked too many questions, just sat on the porch, legs too big for the swing, arms folded as he rocked slightly. Zariah joined him. "You good?" he asked, not looking at her. She shrugged. "Mostly." He nodded. "Mostly ain't nothin'." She smiled faintly. "I'm okay, Grandpa. Just stuff." He nodded again, more slowly this time. Stuff's got a way of growing when you don't name it. He didn't press. But later that night, he called someone. A private consultant he used on his business teams. "I want you to look into the staff at Jefferson," he said, discreetly. He didn't tell anyone. Not Lucille. Not Simone. But something had shifted in his tone. A quiet gravity. At school, Miss Simmons turned it up a notch. She started asking Zariah to model good behavior for the class, asked her to help struggling peers, praised her strong personality, but warned her to be careful not to alienate others. Even during a fire drill, she turned to a nearby administrator and said, loud enough to be heard, "At least we've got Zariah. She's practically one of us when she behaves. One of us." The words clung to Zariah's ribs like cold metal. She felt the walls closing in. The classroom became a cage of double meanings. The hallways, echo chambers. She saw herself shrinking in the eyes of her peers, reshaped by a narrative she couldn't rewrite fast enough. Only one person still looked her in the eye without flinching. Jules. He didn't say much, but during group work, he passed her a note folded into a square. "I saw what she did with the glue." "I'm sorry." Zariah didn't look at him. She just nodded once and slipped the note into her journal. For the first time in weeks, she felt the slightest thread of power return. Not because someone had apologized, but because someone had noticed. And far away, in a quiet downtown office, a tall man with a calm face and tired eyes looked through a file folder marked Jefferson Staff Records. He read the name Lorelei Simmons and frowned, a chill rising in his chest. Because beneath all the honors and accolades, he found something else. A buried complaint. 7 years ago. A different school. Different city. Similar story. And that's when Shaq leaned back, eyes narrowing. Because he knew then, this wasn't just about his granddaughter. It was about something deeper, systemic, repeating. And it was time someone started paying attention. One bottle, one choice, and a silence so loud it shakes the foundations. The morning was deceptively ordinary. The sky above Jefferson Academy glowed a quiet blue, trees rustled politely in the wind, and classrooms buzzed with the low hum of adolescence. Room 3B smelled faintly of markers and citrus cleaner. Students shuffled in wearing headphones, dragging heavy backpacks and heavier silences. Miss Lorelei Simmons stood at the front of the room, her lemon blazer freshly pressed, her eyes darting across the classroom with unnatural brightness. Her smile was pinned on like a brooch, decorative, performative, hollow. She clapped her hands once. Today we're doing something fun. We're blending history and creativity. Everyone will create a cultural identity flag, symbols, colors, anything that represents your heritage. Let's celebrate who we are. There was a scattered murmur of interest. It sounded inclusive, progressive, safe. But Zariah Monroe already knew the truth. The safest words could be wrapped around the cruelest intent. She sat in her seat quietly, her materials ready. Lucille had helped her select fabric pieces from old dresses her great-grandmother once wore. Zariah had printed small black and white photos of her family tree. Women in Sunday dresses, men in military uniforms, children barefoot in churchyards. She had vision, depth, pride. Miss Simmons walked through the rows, passing out glue, scissors, and stencils. Her steps paused longer beside Zariah. "You always go above and beyond, don't you?" she said, voice syrupy and biting. "Hope you leave some creativity for the rest of us." Zariah didn't respond. She focused on her page. The activity began. Kids chatted in low tones. Some drew stars and flags, others cut from magazines. Miss Simmons moved around the room, commenting loudly to students she favored, students with pale skin, lighter voices. Then she approached Zariah's table again. "Zariah, come help me with this example board. I want to show the class a sample layout, and I know you always do such a thorough job." Zariah rose slowly, wary. She walked to the side table where poster boards were stacked beside an open bottle of industrial-strength glue. A squeeze bottle, the kind used for woodworking. "Hold this," Simmons said, handing her a sheet of thick paper. Zariah held the board steady with both hands. Simmons leaned in, held the glue bottle just above. "Don't worry," she whispered. "This won't hurt much." The bottle tilted. A stream of glue, cold, slow, deliberate, slid down and dripped directly into Zariah's hair. Silence cracked the room like thunder. Zariah didn't move. Her body locked, not from pain, but disbelief. The thick viscous substance settled at the crown of her head, tangling instantly in her braids, trickling along the tight rows, hardening. Then came the laughter. Tentative, then louder, nervous. "Oops," Miss Simmons gasped, holding the bottle upright again. "Oh no, these things can be so unpredictable." Zariah's breathing slowed. Her eyes scanned the room. No one stood up. No one came forward. Not a single hand reached for her. Not the boy beside her who flinched. Not the girl who covered her mouth and giggled. Only Jules sat in frozen horror. His eyes wide, his jaw clenched, but his lips remained sealed. Zariah blinked slowly. Her hands lowered the poster board back onto the table, with measured precision. She didn't look at Miss Simmons. She didn't look at her classmates. She turned and walked out. No permission. No hall pass. Just out. Down the hallway. Past classrooms. Past the front office. The receptionist called after her, but Zariah didn't stop. Her feet carried her home as if they already knew the way grief moved. Heavy, quiet, and full of rage. That afternoon, the school called her mother, then her grandmother. Lucille answered. Her voice was calm, but her words were cold. "I'll be there tomorrow, and I won't be alone." Principal Harding issued a formal statement by email. There was an unfortunate accident in room 3B. A student was unintentionally exposed to art materials. We are reviewing the event and assure you safety remains our top priority. There was no mention of names, no ownership of action, no apology. Miss Simmons went home early that day. She told colleagues she was shaken and deeply saddened by how her intention had been misinterpreted. "She's such a sensitive child," she said, filing a report that painted herself as clumsy, not cruel. The students were told to remain focused, to move on. But not everyone did. Jules sat on his bed that night staring at his hands. He hadn't spoken. He hadn't stood up. He'd watched. And that silence now wrapped around him like chains. Zariah sat at her dining table, Lucille combing through her hair gently, whispering words not meant for anyone else to hear. Words of grounding. Words of lineage. Simone watched with eyes full of fire, but lips that remained shut. Because they all knew what would happen next. The school would bury it. The teacher would hide behind policy. The truth would become rumor. Then rumor would become silence. Unless someone broke the pattern. The next morning, Shaquille O'Neal arrived at the Monroe house before dawn. He didn't knock. He walked straight in. Lucille was already up, coffee brewed in the background. Zariah sat at the table, head down, silent. Shaq sat across from her, placed his phone on the table. "Tell me everything," he said, voice low. Zariah didn't cry. She didn't stumble. She recounted the moment with surgical clarity. Her words sliced through the morning light. Shaq listened, didn't interrupt once. When she finished, he nodded once, then stood. He walked out back, pulled out his phone, and dialed a number. "Deshaun, it's time. I need that file." Deshaun Hill was more than an attorney. He was a fixer, a strategist. "I'll send it in 10, the voice replied. Shaq hung up. He stood there, hands in his pockets, staring at the sun rising over the pine trees. His face gave nothing away. But inside, something had shifted. Not anger, not revenge. Something older, sharper. Purpose. Later that afternoon, the Jefferson Academy Board of Trustees received an unexpected meeting request from a Mr. Harrison Day. No one questioned it. But if they had done their homework, they would have realized Harrison Day was the legal alias used by one of the school's largest benefactors. A silent partner. A name that now stood for more than funding. It stood for reckoning. Because Shaquille Big Shaq O'Neal wasn't just coming for answers. He was coming for the foundation. Power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it waits and listens. The next morning came wrapped in cold stillness. Not the kind that follows a storm, but the kind that warns one is coming. Jefferson Academy was back to its polished routine. Polite announcements, student chatter in the quad, teachers straightening their lanyards and lesson plans. Nothing appeared broken on the surface. But at the Monroe home, nothing felt whole. Zariah sat curled on the living room sofa, a soft blue blanket wrapped tight around her shoulders. She hadn't said much since the incident. Her project, the cultural collage she'd prepared with so much care, sat folded on the floor, untouched. Lucille brewed tea, humming hymns older than grief, while Simone walked in and out of the room with the quiet urgency of a mother trying to stay composed. It was Shaq who brought the silence to stillness. He arrived alone, early, and without warning. Dressed in all black, his massive frame seemed to fill the front doorway before he even stepped inside. But his energy didn't announce itself with volume. It arrived with presence. Still, controlled, measured. He said nothing at first, just walked in, nodded at Lucille, and sat next to Zariah without a word. They didn't speak. Not for a long time. Then gently, he placed a small photo on the coffee table. It was faded, almost sepia-toned, and showed a young Shaquille in high school. Tall, awkward, wearing an oversized basketball jersey. His arms were crossed, face neutral. Beside him stood his white coach, smiling too hard. The caption on the back read, 1990 first state win. Zariah glanced at the photo. "Coach Pickman," Shaq said finally. His voice was deep, but soft. "He used to tell me I was lucky to be on the team. Said boys like me needed structure, or we'd end up in handcuffs." Zariah looked up, eyes wide. "He didn't say it in front of the crowd," Shaq continued. "Only during practice, or after everyone left, when it was just me and him and the sound of sneakers on hardwood." He leaned forward, elbows on knees. "I remember scoring 32 points in one game. Afterward, he said, try not to act like a thug when they interview you. I was 16. I didn't even know what that meant at the time." Zariah stared at the rug. Her voice was barely a whisper.
"What did you do?"
Shaq shrugged. "I got louder on the court, quieter off it. I thought if I was good enough, they'd respect me. Turns out, respect isn't something you earn when people don't see your full humanity to begin with." He looked at her then. "And you, what she did to you. That wasn't about glue. That was about control. Erasure. Making sure you knew your place. And you didn't give her that." Zariah nodded slowly. She felt her chest tighten. "I didn't cry," she said. "I know." He patted her knee once, then stood up. Now came the part where silence became strategy. Shaq walked into the back room and closed the door, pulled out his phone. He opened a spreadsheet of Jefferson Academy's internal reports, student data, complaint records, staff evaluations, documents he'd never looked too closely at before. He'd always trusted the numbers to be clean. But now he saw the cracks. Zariah's wasn't the only name with complaints tagged as resolved informally. Miss Lorelei Simmons had 3 other flagged incidents from prior years. 2 girls and 1 boy. All black. All marked no further action. Shaq took screenshots, sent them to 2 contacts. First, Deshaun Hill, a seasoned civil rights lawyer with a reputation for precision. Shaq had worked with him years ago on a community center dispute. The message was brief. "Need a quiet look into a private school's staff records. Priority, I'll cover all costs." Second, Marla Knox, an educational policy consultant who ran an investigative initiative called Students First. He texted her too, looking for patterns. Racism under policy. Starting at Jefferson Academy. Need discretion. They both responded within the hour. Got it. On it. Meanwhile, Jefferson Academy's board members remained unaware. They reviewed cafeteria budgets and updated security policies with the usual detachment of institutional distance. The principal, Mr. Harding, sent out an all-staff memo stating, "We appreciate the staff's professionalism during recent events. Let's continue leading with grace." Ms. Simmons received no reprimand. In fact, she was invited to speak at the upcoming Parent-Teacher Forum on fostering resilience in students. Shaq read that memo and said nothing. Instead, he called in a favor with an old journalist friend, Terrence Malloy, a retired education reporter who still freelanced for national publications. "Terrence," Shaq said, "I'm not dropping bombs. I'm building a case. I'll give you the story when it's ready. Not before, but when I do, I want it told right." Terrence understood. "Just tell me when to sharpen the pencil." Back in her room, Zariah opened her journal again. This time she didn't just write about Simmons. She wrote about her classmates' silence, about the way teachers avoided her eyes, about the laughter that wasn't funny. It wasn't rage on the page, it was clarity. Meanwhile, Lucille and Simone began planning a meeting with school administrators. Not to ask for justice, not anymore. To watch how they handled the truth when it stared them in the face. Because now, it wasn't just Zariah behind the curtain. It was Big Shaq. And no one at Jefferson Academy had any idea that the man quietly gathering files, making phone calls, and studying every policy was the very owner of the ground they walked on. He didn't threaten. He didn't warn. He simply waited. Because silence in the hands of the wise isn't surrender. It's strategy. Long before the truth is shouted, it's whispered in the halls. Jules' heart hadn't slept well in days. He stared at his bedroom ceiling long after midnight, his chest heavy with something that didn't have a name when he first felt it. Something between shame, regret, and fear. The sound of glue dripping into Zariah's hair kept replaying in his head like a punishment. His hands had been clean that day, but his silence wasn't. He hadn't said anything to Zariah since that day in room 3B, and she hadn't looked at him either. That was the worst part, how someone could disappear from your life without leaving the room. She sat 3 rows from him in English, 2 tables away in science, but it might as well have been miles. The day after the incident, Jules had written 3 drafts of an apology and deleted them all. Because words felt cheap, he needed something that mattered. So he turned to someone who always knew what to do with uncomfortable truths. His sister Vanya was 19, home from college on medical leave, and had the kind of anger that didn't wait for permission. She'd been a protest leader at her campus. She knew how systems worked and how to expose them. When Jules finally told her what had happened, her face turned rigid. She poured glue into her hair. She asked, voice clipped. Jules nodded. On purpose. Everyone laughed. She didn't cry. She just walked out. Did the teacher get suspended? No. She's still teaching like nothing happened. Vanya stared at him, then stood and walked toward her desk. What's her name? Miss Simmons. Lorelai. He blinked. Yeah. She started typing. I remember her name. I follow education threads. She's been flagged before. No one ever follows through. Wait, Jules said. Don't put my name on anything. I won't, she said. But this can't stay quiet. Not again. The next morning, an anonymous Twitter account posted a thread. A black middle schooler at an elite private school had superglue poured into her hair during class by her white teacher. The school has done nothing. This isn't fiction. This is Jefferson Academy, room 3B. We know the teacher's name. We know the history. We're watching. Within hours, it had 5,000 views. By lunch, 10,000. By afternoon, it had made its way to the inboxes of students who didn't even know what had happened in the first place. The halls of Jefferson buzzed, not with outrage, but with curiosity. Did you see that tweet? Someone whispered near the water fountain. Who's the girl? I think it's Zariah Monroe. No way. Miss Simmons would never. She's always been weird about her, though. But glue? That's serious. Think they'll shut the post down? Too late. It's everywhere. Zariah knew the moment it went viral. Not because anyone told her, but because the temperature around her changed. Where there had been silence, there was now tension. Classmates glanced at her, then looked away. Teachers grew oddly formal, addressing her with overly polite language, as if tiptoeing through a minefield. In history class, Mr. Davies, who'd always been neutral, said, "Let's focus on healing, not headlines. The internet can distort facts." Zariah didn't respond. but the comment curled in her gut like smoke. Later, in the hallway, a girl from the volleyball team approached her.
Hey, I read that thread. I didn't know it was like that.
She said softly, offering nothing else, no support, no real acknowledgement, just distance disguised as sympathy. The school didn't officially respond, but the energy changed. Meetings were held behind closed doors. Miss Simmons walked the halls more stiffly, her face tight with polite concern. She still smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. In the teacher's lounge, whispers grew louder.
Who leaked it? It's just a tweet, probably exaggerated.
You think that girl will sue? We need to get ahead of this. Simmons began eyeing her students more closely. Her gaze lingered longer on Jules now. Suspicious, narrowed. She noticed the way his shoulders tensed when she called on him, the way he looked away during lessons. She started assigning new seating charts, controlling group projects. She reasserted her presence through micromanagement. But control, once cracked, is never whole again. Across town, in a private office lined with thick carpet and dim lighting, Shaq scrolled through the tweet thread silently. No retweets, no likes, just read, observed, absorbed. Deshaun Hill had called him the moment the thread popped.
This isn't from your camp? He asked.
No, Shaq said. Well, someone knows the story. Shaq leaned back in his chair. Let them talk. You still want to play this quiet? For now, I want to see how deep the rot goes. He hadn't revealed his identity to the school. Not yet. That part of the plan was still cooking. But now he had leverage, public pressure, internal panic, and the slow rising noise of truth beginning to hum underneath a system built on silence. He called Lucille that night. You see what's happening online? I did, she said. Zariah showed me. She okay? She's watching. Quietly. But she's not afraid. Shaq nodded. Good. The next morning, Simmons walked into the staff meeting with a rigid spine and fake composure. Her eyes darted to Principal Harding, who looked more distracted than usual. I think we need to address the elephant in the room, she said finally. There's a campaign of misinformation being spread online about my classroom. Harding blinked. What campaign? That tweet. The anonymous one. Harding sighed. We don't officially acknowledge social media gossip. Our priority is protecting the institution. She stiffened. So we're doing nothing? For now, yes, unless something formal surfaces. That night, Simmons searched for the original tweet. She clicked through the replies, the reposts, the new accounts sharing it. Then she saw it, one reply with a screen grab of a complaint from 2018. Her name, a previous school, a sentence highlighted, student reported verbal humiliation and retaliatory behavior after academic disagreement. She closed the screen, her breath caught in her throat. Someone was digging, and she didn't know who. Back at the Monroe home, Zariah sat in her room with the door cracked open, listening to her mother speak on the phone with a colleague. Simone had shifted from quiet concern to quiet calculation. I want to know who runs discipline at the school. I need records. I'm not just a mother, I'm an organizer. They forgot that. Zariah smiled faintly. The world around her wasn't silent anymore. Whispers were growing into voices. She didn't know who'd posted that tweet or how many people had read it, but it reminded her she wasn't invisible. Jules passed her in the hallway the next morning. His face was pale, his shoulders hunched. He whispered as he passed, I'm sorry. She didn't stop walking, but she said, quietly, thank you. That afternoon, Shaq received another file from Marla Knox, a pattern report, keywords scraped from past student evaluations at Jefferson Academy. One teacher had more flagged phrases than any other. Lorelei Simmons, words like singled out, belittled, targeted. He highlighted them on his screen, then picked up the phone. Deshaun, he said, it's time to move this out of the shadows. To protect themselves, the powerful rewrite the story. By Friday morning, Jefferson Academy buzzed with a new kind of tension controlled, corporate, and carefully managed. The school had called for a mandatory student assembly under the pretense of community reflection. The email sent to parents the night before spoke of unity, resilience, and the importance of coming together during times of confusion. It never mentioned what the confusion was, but everyone knew. Zariah sat near the back of the auditorium, arms crossed, eyes sharp, her back straight as steel. She wasn't given a choice to attend. None of them were. She scanned the crowd. Students filed in, chatting nervously, their eyes bouncing between each other and the stage like popcorn in a hot pan. At the front, Principal Harding stood flanked by Miss Simmons and a few other staff members who looked more polished than usual. Miss Simmons wore a navy blue dress and a smile that didn't blink. Good morning, everyone. Harding began, voice as smooth as glass. We wanted to address some of the confusion that's been circulating online and in the community. The room quieted. Recently, misinformation has been spread about an incident in one of our classrooms. Let me assure you, we take all concerns seriously. After a thorough internal review, we've determined that what occurred was a misunderstanding during an art activity. The staff involved acted with professionalism, and we've seen no evidence of malicious intent. There it was. The room didn't gasp. It didn't need to. The silence said enough. A few students exchanged looks. Some pulled out their phones beneath the seats. Zariah didn't move. Her eyes stayed locked on the stage. Harding continued. Miss Simmons has been an integral part of our academic excellence for 6 years. Her record is outstanding, and she's always held our values of inclusion and respect. A faint applause followed. Sparse, tired. Zariah turned her head slightly and caught Jules staring down at his lap. He looked like he was trying to disappear. Harding cleared his throat. We also want to acknowledge that, in moments of heightened emotion, misunderstandings can happen. We encourage all students to voice concerns in the appropriate channels, rather than through social media. We're here to listen, but we must also be fair. The applause that followed was louder, forced. Some teachers clapped longer than needed. After the assembly, Zariah was called to the counselor's office. Miss Trina Bell, the school counselor, wore a pastel sweater and a pained expression that had been perfected through years of navigating tension without solving it. Zariah, I know this week's been tough, she began gently. We just want to make sure you're feeling supported. Zariah didn't respond. Miss Bell continued. The administration is asking you to sign a behavior review plan. It's not a punishment, more like a check-in system. Just a few weekly meetings with me, so we can make sure nothing escalates. Zariah blinked. Escalates? Ms. Bell hesitated. There were some concerns about classroom disruption, and the way things spread online. We're trying to protect everyone. Zariah stared at the paper in front of her. Words like probation, disruption, and emotional regulation were underlined. She didn't cry. She didn't argue. She stood, slid the unsigned paper back across the desk, and left. That night, at the Monroe house, Zariah sat at the dinner table, unusually quiet. Lucille was stirring collard greens on the stove, while Simone read an article on her phone. Do they think you're dangerous? Simone asked, barely looking up. No, Zariah said. They just think I'm inconvenient. Lucille set down the spoon and turned around. Her eyes found Shaq, who had been standing in the doorway, silent, his face unreadable. Later that evening, after the dishes were done, and Zariah had gone to bed, Shaq sat out on the porch with Lucille. The air was heavy with jasmine and unresolved anger. You gonna tell them who you are yet? Lucille asked. Shaq shook his head. Not yet. I want to see how far they're willing to go. Lucille sighed. I raised you better than that wait and watch mess. That girl's carrying a weight she didn't ask for. Shaq looked down at his hands, massive and quiet. You remember what you told me the day I got benched senior year, when Coach Thomas said I was too loud in the locker room? Lucille smiled faintly. I told you sometimes love is loud. Sometimes it's strategy. But either way, it better leave a mark. Shaq nodded. Exactly. He pulled out his phone, scrolled through an updated dossier from Deshawn. More details on past complaints against Simmons, staff signatures, witnesses, ignored, hidden, forgotten. And there, attached to the bottom, was a parent survey from last year. One anonymous quote read, "This school hides its bias in polished policies. If your child doesn't fit their mold, they get labeled difficult." Shaq tapped the screen twice, then called Marla Knox. Book me a room at that hotel near the campus, he said. I'm meeting with the board next week, privately. You want me to draft an identity release statement for the board? Not yet. I'm going in as Mr. Harrison Day. Marla chuckled. Still using your incognito name? It's useful. People talk more when they don't think you own the roof they're standing under. When he hung up, he sat there a while, listening to the night sounds, the hum of a distant train, the rustle of branches, the slight creak of the porch swing Lucille now sat in. It all felt familiar, like home and firewood, and quiet strength passed down in blood. Back at Jefferson, Simmons was feeling the heat, not from the school, but from her own reflection. She'd noticed students watching her differently, her staff allies avoiding eye contact. She started reviewing her old lesson plans, hunting for cracks. In her office, she spoke with Harding in low tones. I don't like how this is being handled, she said. I'm being scapegoated while the problem festers. Harding raised a brow. Scapegoated? We just publicly defended you. You sounded like you did. But between the tweet, the student gossip, and the rumors about some silent investor investigating us. This is spiraling. Harding shifted uncomfortably. There's no investor. That's just student lore. But even as he said it, doubt crept into his tone. That night, Shaq received a text from an unknown number. No name, just 2 words. They're watching. He didn't reply, just locked the phone, leaned back and breathed out slow. Because the next move was his. And when it came, it wouldn't be noise, it would be something else entirely. They didn't know the man across from them owned the ground they stood on. The Jefferson Academy boardroom was everything the school's reputation promised. Sleek, sterile, and expensively impersonal. A long mahogany table stretched across the center of the room, framed by modern art and a massive seal bearing the school's motto, Virtus, Scientia, Unity. A subtle fragrance of citrus polish floated in the air, and the soft tick of an analog clock filled the quiet space like a warning, too polite to be urgent. 9 board members had gathered that morning. Lawyers, philanthropists, 1 tech executive, and a real estate developer who had donated a new science lab last fall. Principal Harding sat at the far end of the table, shoulders stiff, sipping water like it might shield him. There was an extra chair left unclaimed at the opposite end, reserved for the external investor who had requested the meeting. "Anyone know who this guy is?" whispered one of the members, a former university dean with a reputation for calculated charm. "He's listed as Harrison Day on the ledger," another replied. "Anonymous equity partner, helped fund the West Wing renovation, quiet type." The door opened. And in walked a man whose presence filled more than the room. It shifted the gravity. Shaquille O'Neal didn't need to introduce himself. He didn't wear a suit, no tie, just a dark blazer, open-collared shirt, and a calm that made the air colder. He took the seat at the head of the table, his frame making the chair seem built for a child. His face was unreadable. A few board members blinked. One's mouth opened slightly in shock. Harding straightened. "Mr. Day, thank you for joining us." Shaq didn't respond right away. He opened the leather folio he'd brought, slid it onto the table, and glanced slowly around the room. "I've stayed quiet for a long time," he said. "Invested quietly, trusted your mission, trusted your values. But silence doesn't serve anyone when harm goes unchecked." Someone cleared their throat. Shaq slid the first document out of the folder, a printed screenshot of the anonymous tweet that had set the school community on fire. "This is just the surface, a symptom. What's beneath is the problem." He laid down more documents, student feedback reports, internal emails flagged by investigators, parent surveys with complaints ignored. He didn't speak as he passed them across the table. "I've hired 2 independent researchers. What they found isn't just disappointing, it's dangerous." One of the board members leaned forward, scanning the files. "These are serious claims." "They're more than claims," Shaq said. "They're patterns. There are at least 4 documented incidents involving Lorelei Simmons, 3 of them involving black students, all minimized, all swept under the rug, all marked resolved informally, and your administration called what happened to my granddaughter a misunderstanding." The room stilled. Harding looked up sharply. "Granddaughter?" Shaq's eyes locked onto his. "Zariah Monroe is my granddaughter. I've been funding this institution under the name Harrison Day since 2018. You've all accepted my checks, welcomed my donations, used my name privately for PR leverage. Now you'll hear me publicly." Murmurs erupted across the table. One board member, visibly pale, whispered, "Jesus Christ." Another leaned back, arms crossed. "Why didn't you come forward sooner?" Shaq didn't flinch. "Because I wanted to see who you protect when you think no one's watching." A thin silence fell again. This one edged in something harder than fear: guilt. Principal Harding tried to regain composure. "We acted on the information we had. Ms. Simmons is a respected educator." She poured glue into a black child's hair in front of a full classroom. Shaq cut in. "And you rewarded her with a speaking engagement on resilience." Harding's lips twitched. There were no formal complaints from the family at the time. Lucille's voice echoed in Shaq's mind. "Sometimes love is loud. Sometimes it's strategy." He leaned forward, voice low. "You didn't get a complaint because you've trained families to know it won't matter. You've papered over harm with policies and language that sound inclusive but function as shields. And now you have a choice. Either fix the structure, or I expose it." A younger board member, the only black woman at the table, adjusted her glasses. "What exactly are you proposing?" Shaq turned a page in his folder. "Immediate suspension of Miss Simmons pending external investigation. Formal public acknowledgement of the incident, not a PR scripted statement." a third-party audit of the school's bias reporting system, and a town hall led by students and parents, not staff, about racial safety in this institution. Another board member scoffed. "You're asking us to upend the entire image of Jefferson." Shaq smiled slightly. "No, I'm giving you a chance to live up to it." The room fractured. Some whispered. Others exchanged glances. One older man shook his head, muttering, "This is a nightmare." Shaq stood, towered. "I don't need you to like it, but I own this land, this building, and the very name you put on your brochures. You either fix this now, or I hold a press conference tomorrow." Harding rose halfway, palms open. "Mr. O'Neill, Shaquille, let's be reasonable." "I am. You've got 24 hours." He gathered the remaining documents, left a copy behind, and walked out. Silence swallowed the room behind him. Downstairs, as he stepped into the lobby, a student who recognized him asked for a selfie. Shaq paused, smiled, took the photo, and walked out into the bright sunlight without saying another word. Inside the boardroom, Harding sank into his seat. The storm was no longer coming. It was already here. One voice is quiet. 10,000 are not. The tweet that once hovered quietly in education forums and whisper threads now burned through every major platform like wildfire. By Monday morning, the anonymous thread about the Jefferson Academy glue incident had been retweeted over 60,000 times. News anchors were quoting it. Hashtags like Gluegate and Protect Black Students trended for 3 consecutive days. What started as a single act of humiliation had cracked open a nationwide conversation. Local talk radio hosts debated it over morning coffee. Podcasts released emergency episodes titled The Glue Case and the Truth About White Teachers in Elite Spaces. And at the center of it all was a name that hadn't even been revealed in the original tweet: Zariah Monroe. News crews camped out in front of Jefferson Academy. Helicopters hovered overhead. Reporters stood outside the school gates, peering through the iron like they were hunting for ghosts. Inside the school, things had shifted. Classes continued, technically, but the mood was electric. Students whispered in hallways and filmed TikToks under lockers. Some wore stickers that read, "I believe her." Others stayed quiet, afraid of getting involved. But the true uprising began when the testimonies started to pour in. Former students, now grown, from different cities, different states. They began posting their own stories. At Taya in Theory. Ms. Simmons taught at my middle school in Memphis. She once told me I was too urban to read Shakespeare out loud. Thought I was the only one. At Bren 1989, she gave me detention for correcting her in class. I was 12. My mom pulled me out after the school refused to transfer me. I didn't have the words for it then. I do now. At Ray Writes Now. We told you years ago. You just didn't listen until it went viral. Screenshots flooded Instagram. Reddit threads titled Surviving Simmons ballooned with hundreds of comments. Black students from across the country pieced together timelines, images, emails, receipts that painted a picture the school could no longer whitewash. Zariah, meanwhile, sat inside her room. Blinds drawn, laptop closed. The world knew her name now, knew her face. It didn't matter that she hadn't posted anything herself. They filled in her silence with stories, applause, demands. And she wasn't sure how to feel. "I don't want to be the poster girl for trauma," she told Simone one evening, voice tight with conflict. "I didn't ask for this." Simone sat beside her, stroking her hand. "You didn't. And you don't owe anyone anything, baby. But sometimes the world catches fire because someone lit a match they didn't mean to drop." Zariah swallowed hard. Lucille peeked in, holding a folded news clipping. "They're calling you a symbol, but symbols are just reflections of a truth people were too scared to say out loud." Downstairs, Shaq muted the TV as the anchor's voice trailed off. The incident, now under investigation, has sparked a renewed debate around systemic racism in private schools. Jefferson Academy is yet to release a formal apology, though the school's largest benefactor, revealed to be Shaquille O'Neal, is reportedly demanding accountability. The host turned to her guest, a prominent education advocate. "It's not just about one teacher," the guest said. "It's about an environment that protects those teachers. Simmons is a symptom. The system is the disease." Shaq exhaled slowly and turned off the screen. The next morning, as students filed into Jefferson Academy, they were met with flyers posted all across the building. No one knew who put them up. They simply appeared overnight. "Do you feel safe here? Tell your story. Justice for Zariah." QR codes led to an anonymous testimony form. Over 100 responses were collected by the end of the day. Harding called an emergency staff meeting. "We need to regain control of the narrative," he said, looking more rattled than usual. There are media vans outside. Our phones haven't stopped ringing. I've received calls from the board, alumni, donors. A teacher asked the obvious question. What about Miss Simmons? Harding hesitated. We're reviewing her contract. Someone scoffed. So she's still being paid to stay home? No decisions have been made yet. Shaq listened from a separate line, quietly looped in via his legal proxy. He said nothing. Not yet. Zariah tried to return to school on Wednesday. Her family had voted on it together, over dinner. She said she wanted to try, to see what it felt like. Simone had her doubts, but Shaq simply nodded. You walk in like you belong, because you do. As she stepped onto the campus, students froze. Some stared. Some looked away. Some clapped softly. Jules was waiting at the front gate. He didn't say much, just handed her a folded letter. It read, I was afraid. I'm not anymore. Thank you for being braver than me. She smiled, just slightly. But the media frenzy didn't slow. By lunchtime, her name was trending again. A major morning show requested an interview. Activists began tagging her in calls for reform. And still, Zariah said nothing. That night she curled up in her bed, knees pulled to her chest, and whispered to the ceiling, I'm not ready to be a voice, I'm still a kid. Shaq knocked once, and stepped inside. He sat at the edge of her bed, massive and quiet. You know what I used to think when I was your age, he said, that I had to fix everything myself. That strength meant silence, that if I just worked harder the world would get easier. Zariah looked at him. Did it? No, he said softly, but I got stronger. Not because I was loud, because I learned when to speak and when to listen. He placed a small notebook in her hand. Don't worry about the world yet. Just start with your words. And that night, for the first time since the incident, Zariah wrote, not for school, not for the internet, just for herself. Words that weren't meant to lead a movement, but words that told the truth. The next day, someone from a local paper published a piece titled, The Girl Who Refused to Flinch. It quoted students, cited patterns. But it ended with something even stronger. A scanned note from an anonymous source. I'm not trying to be your headline. I'm just trying to be heard. Don't make me your lesson. Make me your reason to do better. The world leaned in closer. And Jefferson Academy, once proud and polished, was now a case study in how silence can erupt into a chorus that refuses to be ignored. Some heroes are 7 feet tall, others are 13 and unbreakable. The sunlight poured through Zariah's bedroom window as though it were trying to lift her out of bed. But the weight of the world didn't move easily. The attention hadn't faded. It had only intensified. Her name was now woven into hashtags, news clips, and think pieces. But no one was asking how she felt about it. They were interpreting her, framing her, and for a while she let them. Then, one morning, she did something different. She opened her journal, the one she'd used to track every uncomfortable pause, every sugar-coated insult from Miss Simmons, every moment she'd swallowed her voice. She flipped past pages filled with fragments and frustration. Then she turned to a blank page, and she wrote, not like a kid writing to a teacher, not like a victim begging to be understood. She wrote like someone who had lived through something and finally knew how to explain it. She wrote for 3 hours, stopping only when her hand cramped. Then she folded the pages and walked downstairs. Lucille was in the kitchen. Simone was on the couch, reading the latest headline on her phone. Shaq stood near the window, arms crossed, his usual quiet filling the space like furniture. I need you to read something, Zariah said. They gathered at the table, Lucille wiping her hands on a towel, Simone closing her screen, and Shaq giving her his full attention. As Zariah began to read, her voice didn't shake. I've heard what people are calling me. Brave, victim, survivor, leader. I appreciate the words, but I'm not a symbol. I'm a girl, a student, someone who went to school to learn, and ended up being a case study in how quiet harm can echo louder than violence. I don't need pity. I don't want praise. What I want is truth. What I want is space for every kid who looks like me, talks like me, thinks like me to show up without shrinking. I'm not angry, but I'm done being silent, and if telling my truth helps one other person step into theirs, then it's worth it. She ended with a line she hadn't shared even with her family before. I forgive Miss Simmons, but I will never forget, because remembering is how we prevent it from happening again. When she finished, no one spoke right away. Then Lucille, eyes misty, reached across the table and squeezed her hand. Shaq nodded once. Let's publish it, as is. Zariah looked surprised. Really? He smiled. You already said it better than any of us could. That afternoon, with the help of Marla Knox, Zariah's letter was published as an open op-ed in The Atlantic and syndicated within hours. It wasn't a rant. It wasn't a list of demands. It was measured, wise, a testimony, not a takedown. And the world listened. Students across the country shared it with hashtags like Zariah's words and My Turn to Speak. Teachers held classroom discussions. Activists printed excerpts on signs. Celebrities reposted it with comments like, "The future is here." At Jefferson Academy, the administration held a closed-door emergency meeting. Harding, red-faced and pale, couldn't spin it anymore. "Effective immediately," he announced. "Miss Simmons is placed on administrative leave pending full investigation." That single sentence rippled across the halls faster than gossip ever could. Some students cheered. Others just whispered. And Zariah? She didn't react. Not outwardly. She'd already moved past the punishment. Her eyes were fixed on the bigger picture now. Later that week, Shaq invited Jules to a quiet sit-down in his private office, not as an interrogation but as a conversation. Jules sat across from him, clearly nervous, fidgeting with his sleeves. Shaq spoke first. "You were there. You saw what happened. And I know that kind of silence, it doesn't leave easy." Jules looked up slowly. "I didn't know what to do. I wanted to say something, but I felt stuck." "That's normal," Shaq said. "But silence is also a choice, just like speaking up is." Jules took a breath. "I want to do the right thing, now." Shaq nodded. "Then write your own truth. You don't need to protect anyone who wouldn't do the same for you." The next day, Jules submitted a written testimony to the school board and allowed his letter to be shared publicly. It was short, honest. "I saw what happened. I saw Miss Simmons pour the glue. I saw her laugh when Zariah left the room. I didn't stop it, and that shame will never leave me. But I hope this helps her, and maybe helps someone else too." It did. More students came forward, quietly, one by one. And Zariah, for the first time in weeks, sat in her favorite corner of the library, headphones in, journal open, but this time not writing pain. She was outlining something else. Ideas, programs, a way to create space for voices like hers. Not just reaction, but reconstruction. The storm had passed, but Zariah had decided to stay standing. Cowardice lives in silence. Redemption begins with truth. It started in Jules' Hart's bedroom. Just a single afternoon. A laptop, a phone angled toward the light, no filter, no edits. Just him, pale, nervous, sitting on the edge of his desk chair, breath uneven and voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't say anything when it happened," he began, "and that's something I'll carry." He looked straight into the camera, swallowing hard. "I was in the room when Miss Simmons poured glue into Zariah's hair. I saw the look in her eyes, calculated. I heard her say, 'This won't hurt much,' and I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because I panicked. I froze. Then I shut up like everyone else." The words stumbled out at first, but with every sentence, his spine straightened. Shame turned into accountability. He cleared his throat. "Miss Simmons has a way of making you think it's normal. She hides it behind compliments and jokes. But I watched her target Zariah over and over again. Praise that was really a warning. Smiles that were really threats. Racism that wore lipstick and lanyards." He paused, letting the silence sit for a beat. "I'm not here to be forgiven. I'm here because truth matters, and Zariah deserves it. All of us do." He hit upload. Within 3 hours, the video had 100,000 views. By morning, it had crossed 2 million. Every major network carried the headline, "Student confirms racist attack at elite school." The Jefferson Academy leadership scrambled. Principal Harding issued a vague statement about ongoing reviews, but the truth was already out, and it didn't need approval. Parent groups who had once politely nodded now raised their voices. An open letter from over 200 families circulated, demanding a complete overhaul of the Academy's bias training programs, new hiring protocols, and the removal of any staff found complicit in covering up racial misconduct. The same halls that once hummed with silent complicity now echoed with conversations students had never dared to have. In a packed school auditorium later that week, Jules was invited to speak at a town hall forum hosted by Students First, the advocacy group Shaq had brought in after his meeting with the board. He stood at the podium, pale and visibly shaken. But this time he didn't need the script in his hand. He looked at the crowd of students, parents, and faculty, and said, "I was part of the problem until I decided not to be. If you're waiting for the right moment to do the right thing, it already passed, so do it now." When he stepped down, the room was still, not out of discomfort, but out of respect. Shaq waited near the side door, arms folded, expression calm but proud. He walked over to Jules in full view of the room, placed a massive hand on his shoulder, and said, "Takes more strength to tell the truth than to dunk a basketball." The comment drew laughter. Not nervous laughter, relieved, healing. Jules looked up at him, stunned. "Thank you for not hating me." Shaq gave a small shake of the head. Hating don't fix the past, but telling the truth? That might fix the future. Meanwhile, Ms. Lorelei Simmons was nowhere to be found. The district confirmed she'd taken an indefinite leave. Her school email auto-replied with a sterile message, "Out of office, no further comment." Neighbors said she hadn't been home in days, her car gone, blinds drawn. But her story wasn't over. In a quiet corner of the internet, an anonymous Reddit user posted a document labeled "Complaint Against Simmons, 2016. The file included testimony from a mother in Memphis, nearly identical to Zariah's story. A teacher who weaponized praise, a daughter who withdrew mid-semester. Another thread followed from a boy in St. Louis. Same tactics, same teacher, same silence. The digital record was becoming undeniable. Still, not everyone welcomed the truth. Jules faced his share of backlash. Some students called him a traitor. Others said he only came forward to clear his own name. He was shoved once in the hallway, not with fists, but with words that landed just as heavy. "You ruined her life," someone whispered, "and yours too." He said nothing, but he kept showing up. And one morning he found a note inside his locker, written in handwriting he didn't recognize. "Thank you for saying it out loud. We needed someone to go first." Back at home, Zariah watched it all unfold from a quiet distance. She hadn't posted anything new since her letter went public, but she had started receiving emails dozens a day. Middle schoolers in Arkansas, high schoolers in Connecticut, one from a teacher in Chicago who wrote, "You reminded me why I became an educator." Zariah read them all. She didn't always reply, but she saw them. She felt them. One evening, Shaq found her outside on the porch, watching the sun drop below the trees. He sat beside her, shoulder to shoulder, their size difference almost comic. "You okay?" he asked. "I don't know," she admitted. "It's all so loud now." Shaq nodded. "It gets loud before it gets clear." "I didn't want any of this," she said. "I know," he replied, "but sometimes the fight finds you. Doesn't mean you're not built for it." She leaned into his shoulder, and for the first time in a long time she let herself exhale. Inside, Lucille was watching the news. The headline crawled across the bottom of the screen. "Student Truth Teller Sparks National Policy Review." The footage showed Jules speaking, then a still of Zariah's letter, then a quiet photo of Miss Simmons, face blurred in motion. Lucille shook her head. "Lord, look at how far the truth travels once it's free." And outside, under the fading pink of twilight, Zariah whispered to herself, barely loud enough for the wind to carry, "I'm not just surviving anymore. Some ghosts don't stay buried, but truth is stronger than shame." Silence had cloaked Lorelei Simmons for nearly 2 months. The woman once known for her pastel blazers, curated tone and classroom praise turned poison had vanished from the public eye. Her house sat empty, curtains drawn. Her voicemail was full. Her email bounced back with auto-replies. People assumed she'd moved, disappeared, been swallowed by the internet's judgment and memory. But Lorelei Simmons wasn't gone. She was preparing. And when she returned, it wasn't with remorse. It was with paperwork. In mid-April, Jefferson Academy's administrative office received a thick envelope marked Simmons v. Jefferson Academy. The former teacher was suing the institution for defamation, emotional distress, wrongful termination of contract, and reputational damage. The story hit the local paper first, then spread outward like oil on water. Ex-teacher accused in glue case sues elite school for millions. Mrs. Simmons' legal argument was clear. The academy had failed to protect her from what she called a smear campaign, led by a student with social media clout. Her legal team framed her as a victim of cancel culture, insisting that her track record as an educator had been tarnished without a proper investigation. The school board was stunned, but Shaq wasn't. He'd seen it before. When silence couldn't protect the guilty, they reached for the law, not to uncover the truth, but to rewrite it. The school's legal team moved quickly. They wanted to settle, quietly, cheaply. Shaq said no. "If you settle, you tell every student watching that silence wins," he told the board during a special session. "You tell them their truth is negotiable." Simone agreed. "This is bigger than her now. This is a precedent." And Zariah, she said nothing, but she nodded. The case moved to court. Day 1 arrived under gray skies. Protesters gathered outside in muted clusters. Some held signs, others just stood in quiet vigil. Students from Jefferson wore pins with Zariah's initials. Journalists lined the sidewalk like birds waiting to peck apart the proceedings. Inside, the courtroom felt colder than it should. Ms. Simmons arrived in a charcoal pantsuit, lips pressed tight, hair pulled back into a bun so severe it looked like armor. Her lawyer, a polished man with a silver tie and condescending smirk, spoke first. My client has suffered immeasurable emotional damage as a result of unverified accusations and media frenzy. We intend to prove that Jefferson Academy failed in its duty of care and contributed to irreparable harm. Then came the Academy's legal team, led by Deshaun Hill. He didn't posture, he didn't raise his voice. He simply placed a stack of documented complaints on the table. And then, the witnesses were called. Shaq testified first. He stood tall in the witness box, his presence stretching beyond the wood and walls. Dressed in a plain black suit with no tie, he answered questions with the same calm he used to command courts. When did you first learn of Ms. Simmons' actions? The prosecutor asked. When I saw the look in my granddaughter's eyes and read her journal, he replied. That told me more than any policy report ever could. He detailed the investigation he'd commissioned, the patterns they'd uncovered, the testimonies from former students. Ms. Simmons' lawyer tried to paint him as emotionally biased. Mr. O'Neill, are you sure this isn't about protecting your family name? Shaq looked him in the eye. I've protected my family for 30 years. This isn't about a name. This is about every kid who thought silence was safer than speaking. Next came Zariah. She walked to the stand with quiet confidence, not performative, not dramatic, just rooted. She didn't cry. She didn't rage. She simply told the truth. She made me feel like my excellence was an accident, like I didn't belong unless I bent myself to fit her version of acceptable. When asked why she hadn't spoken out sooner, she replied, because I was taught that being strong meant staying quiet. I know now that's not true. Her testimony was short, but it lingered. The room held its breath when Lucille took the stand. Dressed in a navy coat dress, pearls at her throat, her voice was the softest of the three, but her words hit hardest. I grew up in the South, she said. I've seen what harm looks like in plain sight, but I've also seen what it looks like when it's dressed in policy and painted as professionalism. She turned slightly, eyes falling on Simmons. You didn't break my granddaughter. You tried, but you didn't. And now this court has the power to say not again. The courtroom was silent. Simmons didn't look up. After 4 days of testimony, the jury deliberated. It didn't take long. By the following afternoon, the verdict was delivered, in favor of Jefferson Academy and Zariah Monroe. No damages awarded to Simmons, no validation of her claims. The court also issued a statement recognizing the case as a significant moment in addressing racial bias in private education. Outside, as cameras flashed, Shaq placed a hand on Zariah's back and guided her gently through the crowd. No cheers, no media podiums, just the quiet of a storm finally passing. Simmons was not seen again after the verdict. Some say she moved to Arizona. Others believe she changed her name. But wherever she went, the truth followed. And in classrooms across the country, educators discussed the case, not in whispers, but in lesson plans. Because Zariah's stand didn't just end a case. It began a standard. From ashes we build something better. Not for applause, but for justice. 1 year later, the sign out front had changed. The gates once etched with Jefferson Academy for Excellence were now proudly engraved in polished black steel. The Lucille O'Neill Center for Equity and Learning. No banners, no trumpets, no ribbon-cutting ceremony with politicians. Just the quiet reveal of a name earned through legacy, not legacy bestowed by privilege. Inside, the once intimidating marble foyer had been softened by murals, portraits of changemakers, student artwork, quotes by Black thinkers painted along the walls in bold lettering. What had once felt like a museum for the elite now pulsed with color, youth, and purpose. Shaq stood just beyond the threshold, hands in the pockets of a charcoal jacket, staring up at his mother's name. He'd paid for the redesign himself, quietly, as always. But this time, he hadn't done it as a benefactor. He'd done it as a grandfather, as a father, as a son. Lucille didn't know they were naming it after her until the plaque was installed. When she saw it, she didn't say anything for a full minute. Then, with a small smirk, she whispered, "'Bout time y'all put some respect on Grandmama's name." Inside the renovated halls, students buzzed between classrooms that no longer operated on silence. The curriculum had changed. Not entirely, but meaningfully. History included voices once skipped. English syllabi featured books that made some parents uncomfortable, but made students think. In what used to be room 3B, there now hung a framed piece of art, a collage of quotes from anonymous students, centered around a new statement painted across the back wall in black script. Silence was never safety. Truth is, Zariah Monroe didn't sit in the back anymore. She didn't need to. Now a high school freshman, she'd grown into herself without apology. Her braids were longer, her gaze more direct. She wasn't louder, just more deliberate. When she spoke, people leaned in, not because of what she'd survived, but because of how she chose to lead. She had launched a student-led digital campaign called Voices Not Vessels, a platform for young people across the country to anonymously share their experiences with racial bias in schools and submit reform proposals to their local districts. Within months, it had been featured by NPR, partnered with 2 national education coalitions, and adopted by over 50 schools. But Zariah never let it turn her into something she wasn't. She still took her time, still read novels in the corners of libraries, still journaled more than she posted. Her power hadn't come from the internet or attention. It had come from surviving a lie and choosing to tell the truth anyway. One afternoon, she walked the halls with Jules. The two weren't best friends. They didn't pretend to be, but there was a trust there now, forged not in perfection, but in the hard honesty of shared responsibility.
I still think about it sometimes, Jules admitted. What I didn't do.
Zariah didn't correct him. She didn't offer comfort, just walked alongside him and said, "What matters is what you're doing now." That same day, in the staff lounge, redesigned with open-concept seating and a new wellness room, Miss Tanya Benning, the school's first director of cultural accountability, reviewed a presentation for next week's parent symposium. The title slide read, "Bias is not the end of the conversation. It's the beginning." Staff trainings were now mandatory. Reporting systems had been rebuilt from scratch. An equity board of students, parents, and outside observers met monthly to audit school practices. There were still disagreements, still missteps, but now people listened. That was the real change. Shaq sat in his office, overlooking the quad. He rarely used it. It was more symbolic than functional. On his desk were 3 things: a framed photo of Zariah smiling on the day the court ruled in her favor, a thick binder labeled National Youth Justice Pilot Program, and a sticky note from Lucille that read, "You done good, baby. Now let them run it." He smiled at it. There were moments he still remembered the first time he walked those halls as a silent investor, watching harm pretend to be excellence. How many smiles had he mistaken for integrity? How many educators had he trusted to build equity, only to realize they'd simply learned how to code their bias into policy? He'd learned the hard way that power meant nothing if you didn't use it to shift the ground beneath you. And shift it he had. Now schools across the country were calling, asking how to replicate the model. Media dubbed it the Shaq blueprint, but he always corrected them. "This isn't my blueprint," he told a reporter. "It's Zariah's. It's Lucille's. I just helped pour the concrete." As dusk settled in, Shaq decided to take a walk through the halls, not with an entourage, not for a press tour, just him. He moved slowly, nodding at students, smiling at teachers. In the newly built Freedom Commons, a space for open discussions, assemblies, and student-led forums, he paused to read a quote etched into the back wall in soft gold. "We were taught to survive in silence. Now we thrive in truth." He took a long breath. Outside, the sky deepened into a warm lavender. Spring air carried faint laughter from the courtyard. Zariah sat under a tree, books open beside her, earbuds in, swaying gently to something only she could hear. Shaq watched for a moment. She hadn't noticed him yet. And for once he didn't interrupt. He turned back, walking the halls alone. Not because he had to, but because he wanted to feel what had been rebuilt. This wasn't closure. It was continuation. Justice, he knew, was never a final chapter. It was a seed. And here, under this roof, it had taken root. Because now, the academy wasn't just for excellence. It was for truth. And the fight? It was in safer hands. If this story stirred something in you, don't let it fade. Start the conversation in your own community, your own school, your own home. Listen deeper, question louder, protect the ones who are often unheard. Change doesn't begin with policy. It begins with people who refuse to look away. Be one of them.